Ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure and privilege to be here this morning. The international system has been gravitating in various ways. If a Martian came down to Earth trying to write the logic of the evolution in the past 100 years, 50 years, 10 years, a year, he will find, or she will find it very difficult to identify the compass that led the system. So that's why it is so both challenging and important to have this meeting today. And let me just say that coming to Vienna is always a pleasure. And my dear friend who is sitting next to me, Governor Nowotny, we have been going together for many, many decades. And he assured me that he will provide the best weather that Vienna can give. And which means, the question is, was he wrong? Or does he have a different definition of the best? And I think that reconciling these two is key in order to see what kind of system we need and how do we go forward. Is it just wrong implementation of something that we knew needed to be done? Or is it learning by doing as we move ahead and do what we need to do? To have, since I'm the first who got the microphone, I'm going to monopolize it for a few minutes, and to be here together with the distinguished owners of this event, Mark and Your Excellency, the Ambassador, is again fantastic. Because if it's, I will not introduce them in any way, except to say that it exactly takes the broad portfolio and experience and perspectives that the Ambassador brings with vast experience, and of course our good friend and colleague Mark Uzan, who I think that he is a public good. There is no way that so many individuals from all over the world, in so many places, in so many times, would have gotten together, and therefore the mechanism to internalize the externalities would not have been in place if it was not for Mark Uzan. So at the end, normally, you know, people say, why do we tip in restaurants after the meal rather than before the meal? And the answer is you want to keep the incentives to make sure that the things are fine, and then you tip after the meal. But in this particular case, I can feel very confident that I can congratulate Mark even before he presented the meal, and we will, I'm sure, will not be disappointed. The subject of the conference today is really wide and broad, as the composition of the audience testifies. Words like decoupling are in the air. Fragmentation is in the air. And you ask yourself, decoupling from what? When you say decoupling, is it something good or bad? Is it a problem or is it a solution? Fragmentation of what? From something that was perfect, or is it the start of the solution? Globalization, deglobalization, etc. We can play with these words as much as we want. But there is one thing which is true, which is the nature of globalization is changing, may be changing, but the essence of interdependence remains. And therefore, the fact that we have diverse world with interdependence is the raison d'etre why we are looking for a system that will allow the negative consequences of this interdependence to be offset by the positive consequences. So therefore, let's not kid ourselves. When we speak about deglobalization, it does not mean everyone is on his own, because if that's the case, then the interdependence will not be managed. So we are really in search of realism, saying maybe the first best solution is not with us, what is the second best, and how can we identify it? I started by saying that if you are traveling on the road without signs and without marks and without knowledge if there is an exit and where there is an exit, you feel very much at loss. Those of us who walked even from the hotel to come here appreciate how important it was to have those signs every 5 meters. Where is this meeting place? And it looks like an obvious thing, but it is the lack of information that causes the drivers to drive with less confidence and with less courage to do the right moves at the right time. And this is the reason why we have safety nets in the circus, so that the acrobat will not need them, because he will have the confidence that if something happens, somebody or something will save him. So this is really what we are talking. Also, when we talk about a financial system, we ask, what is the lender of last resort in case of a collapse? The fact that we are talking about the extreme cases is not part of our forecasting, but it is part of our effort to make sure that the system remains in place. And this is very important, because I still remember at the very beginning of the discussion, and I will not say which central bank, of the discussion of doing unconventional monetary policies, I was asking, I was talking a lot to these governors at that time, and I was asking them, okay, but it is clear that you are departing now from the main highway, and that's why you call it unconventional monetary policy. If you do it in if you wait for another year, or 2 years, or 5 years, or 10 years, will the unconventional become the conventional? Does it confuse matters that have we departed from our long conventions? Does it indicate a departure to a new paradigm? Or is it indicating a detour that hopefully will have a re-entry afterwards? The driver must know this kind of thing. So when we talk about the roads and about the rules of the road, we are really talking also about the confidence that the drivers have in navigating in this murky, snowing, and unclear direction. And in fact, the past few years have indicated good examples, as Mark Uzan started by saying, higher for longer. Higher than what? Longer, why? If higher for longer is the right thing, then that's the answer. If higher for longer means a detour, then where do we go back? So for this, we need to have a consensus of saying what is the real equilibrium towards which we are gravitating. And if it is that the case, we need to have a consensus. This is the system that we want to operate, because we have to be in the same orchestra, playing according to some music, and not everything is so harmonious as Mozart would have done in Vienna, but we need to find a way to really do all of this. We have with us a very important statistician in background who did his academic work on developing what is called Bayesian econometrics, which means when we see an observation that is an outlier to what we normally think is the right thing, how do we think about it? That it is an outlier, or maybe it's an indication for a new regime. That's what Bayesian analysis is about. We have two paces. So I will not divert too much, but to say that globalization is efficient and painful. As Pascal Lamy once said, deglobalization is inefficient but painful. And the question is now, you have to choose. Look, you have a table of deglobalization, of efficient, inefficient, painful, painless. What system will bring us to where we are? And the answer differs for who you are. If you are in China, maybe the answer is different than if you are in the United States. But you are still interdependent. Let me make a statement that I'm sure is right. The world cannot resume growth without China. Whatever is the political orientation, this is the challenge. How to make sure that we don't throw the baby with the water tub. So consensus must be built, compass must be created, and all of what we are talking about is fine. Now, let me take you back to the world of central banking. The world of central banking has been a very complex world, and it has been also a very simple world. When I was appointed governor of a central bank 30 years ago or more, it was a very simple task. You knew what you need to do. There was high inflation, and the objective was stabilize it and lower it. And the tools were very well defined. The interest rates, done deal. So much so that the politicians thought we can close the central bank because every child knows to see where we are. It has become much more complex. The shocks are coming internationally, domestically, from the real side, from the financial side, from the monetary side. And the toolkit is also expanding and limited. As central banks have lowered interest rates to zero, the feeling was that somehow we lost our ammunition, and I think we did. But then the question is, you still need to do something, especially as the challenges have broadened themselves to include financial stability. And if that's the case, what should you do? And the temptation was, okay, let me do something which is unconventional. I will buy assets in the markets. I will change the structure of my balance sheets. So for the economists and the people in this group, you know what it means. But it is fundamentally different than what it used to be. And after a while, the conventional became unconventional, and the unconventional, you got used to it, and the question is, what about exit? And when I ask some of the colleagues of the central banking, when will you exit? You know it's not sustainable. And I must tell you, I will quote to you, and it's a serious, one of the major central bankers, and Governor Nowotny knows him very well. And I will say know him or her because I don't want to indicate who she was or he was. In this modern era, I will use the word he to refer to both he and she, no gender. And the answer was, Jacob, I know it is not sustainable, but if I discuss exit and say that there is exit, it will be interpreted that I'm ready to exit. And I'm not ready to exit. And if they think that I'm ready to exit, it will undercut my policies because they will not behave according to where we are. So I rather not speak about the exit, not realizing that the drivers going on this highway are all the time looking for the exit, but they don't know if there is, and they are very, very confused. So this is, again, something for the nature of communication in our business, the nature of articulating it, and the nature of differentiating between what messages we want to give and what messages are accepted. We need to remember always that every communication has three components: the transmitter, the message, and the receiver. It is enough that one of those three is not fully aligned for confusion to be in place. We focus a lot about the message when we talk about open market operations and or communiques, and each word matters, etc. Much less about the quality of the transmitter, and even less about assuring that the receiver gets what the message was supposed to be about. So I think in this complexity, this is another chapter that we will need to do this. So I took you for too long for a detour, and then you will think that this is the new convention. No, it was unconventional. It was a detour, and we'll come back to normal business. And now the question is, what is normal? The new normal or the old normal? So let me stop with playing with words and go immediately to the subject matter. And the subject matter is, Mark already said, higher for longer. You did not say higher what? And longer in what measures? Higher interest rates, higher prices, higher growth, higher welfare, higher confusion, higher what? Which is intentionally he left it open, because we have to understand there is no free lunch. In fact, there is nothing more expensive than a free lunch. If you do something that seems very simple and easy, then you are not going in the right place. We have several very rich panels in front of us. or on my side, I should say. And and I will start with, most people have received clear instructions, no PowerPoints or things of that type, so that we can use the tools of communications that we were grown from kindergarten. But in order to set the stage, we are fortunate to have with us Lombardi Marco Jacopo. He's senior economist from the Bank of International Settlement, the BIS. He's the one to whom I refer to when I mentioned Bayesian econometrics. Very brilliant analyst who will give us, first of all, a panoramic view of what are we talking about? Where are we in this context? And I can tell you, for all the speakers here, the resumes are very impressive, and I will not, don't be upset if I don't mention any element of it, except to say that you are from the BIS, and the rest I will do the same, because the technology of the organizers of the conference has been so efficient that you just go to the program, you put your cursor on the name, and suddenly you see the world. You see all the resume of the person that you were talking about. So I don't want to deprive you from the pleasant surprise. And Jacopo, Lombardi, the floor is yours, please.
Okay. Let me start by thanking Mark, thanking all the organizers for inviting me to take part in this very distinguished panel. I'm really honored to be here, and thank Governor Frenkel for nodding at my formation as a Bayesian econometrician. That is something that somehow got submerged after years of analysis and policy work that relies not so much on my research skills, not that often, and so I'm happy that this is anyway acknowledged. So my task today is, I think, to try to frame the issue of higher for longer, and by answering some basic questions that should guide the following discussion. And I will do so using some analytics that hopefully at some point I'll manage to project on the screen there. So there's two questions that I would like to tackle. The first is, what are we talking about when we say higher for longer? Meaning, what do we exactly mean? And the second question is then, why are we in a higher for longer situation as everyone seems to agree? That's the first slide I put together to set the stage. Current situation of the current status of inflation. I would say that we're in a phase in which it seems that inflation is receding, and that's mainly on the back of the dissipation of the shocks that first ignited it. I'm talking about the oil prices, which stabilized, and supply chain disruptions that finally receded. That's the two blue lines in the graph. And on the back of that, it looks like inflation is roughly on track towards the target we have. The red line is core inflation in the US, and the orange line is HICP core for the euro area. So they peaked some time ago, a bit later for the euro area, but now they're moving downwards, hopefully towards trend in a not so sluggish fashion, so to say. And this is also coming on the back of moderating economic activity to some extent. There are signs that economic activity is slowing down, even not as much as some people might believe, given the extent of policy tightening. Okay, so this seems, at first sight, to paint a relatively rosy picture of the current status of the economy and when we are heading to. But the looming question that central bankers and commentators faced over the past months of high inflation has been, how do we stand compared to an episode in which disinflation clearly failed, that is the 70s. Have we, by tightening policy as fast as we did, averted a return to the 70s? And here, if you look, if you put the current inflation episode in historical perspectives, things are not that comforting, I should say. So the graph on the left side depicts the evolution of headline inflation across a panel of countries and episodes in the 70s, that's the red line, and against the current episode, that's the blue line. So the striking feature of this graph is that the surge in inflation has been relatively similar across the two episodes, and also the first phase of this inflation so far is broadly similar. So you see that the blue line for the part that is available to the right of the zero line is moving more or less with the same speed as the red one. Now, what went wrong in the 70s then, it's not really the first phase of disinflation. That is when originating shocks dissipate and somehow take the pressure off. The challenging part is the second phase. You see when the red line plateaus, and plateaus at a level that is actually much higher compared to where we started. So it's plateaus at -4, having started from -8, compared to the peak, which means that after the episode was over, inflation was still 4 percentage points above target. That's not the result we want to achieve now. So it looks like now things are going okay, but we might face, looking ahead, a problem with the so-called last mile, that is this point where the red line plateaus. And we want to make sure that instead the blue line goes back to -8 as well, that is bringing us back to the target of 2% of inflation. Okay? So one key difference that brings some sense of positivity is the fact that the tightening of policy rate in real terms has been somewhat faster in the recent episode. You can see that in the panel on the right. Even if central banks started tightening if you want, a bit not so immediately when inflation started surging, you see that now the blue line, sorry, is way above the red line, which means that real rates are higher, they're kept higher, even in the face of declining inflation. So this is something that brings some sense of optimism to the current conditions and to the fact that central banks have been doing the right thing. So why is then higher for longer something that we might need? Well, inflation, as I said, is going down. And there's also evidence that this tighter monetary policy that has been deployed is actually transmitting to financial conditions. This is something you can see in the left-hand panel there. There you have the dotted lines are measures of the policy rate, and the solid lines are a measure of financial conditions. For the current cycle, that's the red line, and the past cycles, that's the pink line. And you see that both the extent of policy tightening and the transmission to financial conditions has been much faster and much more intense compared to past episodes. So that's news, good news, that the transmission mechanism of tighter monetary policy is working as it should. Yet we still face this situation in which economic activity is actually quite resilient to the policy tightening. And again, that's something that the right-hand panel shows. In the past cycles, as defined in the panel next to it, a tightening of financial conditions was associated with a decline in economic activity. That's the red line. Instead, in the current cycle, this effect did not materialize yet, at least, and if anything, the impact of financial conditions on economic activity is positive, even if not statistically significant. So, is this what calls for higher for longer? That's the reason why we need higher for longer. This lack of apparent transmission to economic activity and therefore to inflation. Well, Let me first propose two possible interpretations of what we mean by higher for longer. Okay. So the first one is that higher for longer is something that reflects the necessity of keeping nominal rates higher, and therefore the policy stance tighter, because the transmission of the policy tightness to economic activity and inflation is weaker than what expected, or maybe slower, and it takes more time to materialize. This is actually something that's consistent with the evidence I showed above about a weak transmission of financial conditions to economic activity, as well with a relatively flat Phillips curve, which is something that we've been grappling with for quite some time, even before COVID and even before the great financial crisis, I would say. So what is the key challenge if this is the correct reading of things? That by keeping the policy stance too tight for too long, because we don't see yet effects on inflation and economic activity, we might end up in a situation in which the effects materialize all at once through financial stress and a deep recession, which is something we definitely want to avoid. Another possible interpretation, instead, is that in the way I portrayed the situation so far, I used interchangeably the words high nominal rates and tight policy. This is not necessarily the case. So the necessity of having high nominal rates may actually reflect the fact that the benchmark for the tightness of policy, the equilibrium interest rates, or as it's called in jargon, R star, is actually higher than it used to be in the past and than what people believed. So the consequence is that the monetary policy stance and therefore financial conditions are not really as tight as we think. And so this explains why the transmission mechanism to economic activity and inflation appears to be weaker. The underlying reason why the equilibrium rates can actually be higher or can have moved higher is that firms and households can actually tolerate higher rates better than we thought. So maybe nominal rates at the levels we have now are not so impactful on the cash flow of households and firms, and so they don't really adjust their spending as much as we would like. So this is something that would be reflected in a higher equilibrium rate. Now, in this situation, it's clear that the associated risk is not that of abrupt recession or a financial crisis. It is more that of inflation running above target for longer amid these conditions that firms and households can stand up to higher rates, and therefore inflation running above target for too longer could lead to a partial de-anchoring of expectations, which will prevent the achievement of the last mile of disinflation. So you see that under two slightly different interpretations of what's going on and what people mean with higher for longer, you reach quite different conclusions in terms of what the risks are, and as I will discuss in a few minutes, the policy challenges ahead. So unfortunately, it's very hard to distinguish where do we stand. I mentioned equilibrium interest rates. Well, that's something that we are not able to measure, so it must be inferred from the data. And the uncertainty surrounding these estimates is quite substantial. So here I put together three different ways of approaching the measurement of equilibrium rates for the US. The blue lines are a variation of the so-called Laubach and Williams approach. And you see that these estimates are mildly increasing up to the moment inflation kicks in, and then they start declining. Yet another approach, that's the Lubick and Mathis, that's another alternative to measure this unobservable quantity, actually gives a similar picture in the first part of the sample, but then you see that at the end the red line diverges, and this approach tells you that as inflation goes up, the equilibrium rate is actually estimated to go up. And here I didn't even mention the uncertainty, the statistical uncertainty surrounding these estimates, which is really massive. So it's really hard to pin down this equilibrium rate from the data, and these measures that I put together, they just serve as sort of a material for an informed discussion of the issue. So it's very hard to navigate the current situation, and the important thing to keep in mind, however, is that under the two interpretations, there's very different implications, especially for the longer run, the future of interest rates and policy rate. So if the interpretation of weaker transmission that requires a tighter stance for a longer period is correct, then we're implying that in the end, when inflation is finally back to target, rates will have to normalize and go back to a neutral, if you want, level. Now, this neutral level, if the equilibrium rate has not changed, will be more or less close to what we had estimated prior to the COVID outburst, which means quite close to zero. This means that when the next recession hits, after this normalization hopefully has taken place and not before the process is over, we will be again close to the zero lower bound, and yet again we will face the problem of having to deploy unconventional policies that maybe throughout these years we're becoming more familiar with the way they work, but they're still surrounded by a considerable degree of uncertainty, especially in what concerns the side consequences of large central bank balance sheet and asset purchasing programs. And as Governor Frenkel said, I think it's fair to say that this is not the highway, and the road of unconventional policies is still a less explored one that, if possible, one would like to avoid driving on. Having higher likelihood of having to deploy central bank asset purchases another time means that there will be overall a higher burden on the central bank to deal with the next recession when it comes. The central bank will be the one who will be called to provide monetary stimulus, especially in a situation in which we have a legacy of high government debt, which limits the scope of fiscal interventions. Now, under the other interpretation, the higher equilibrium rate, well, if the equilibrium rate is higher, it means that rates, nominal rates, will remain higher forever. In a sense, this is not such a bad news for monetary policy makers, knowing that households and firms can actually tolerate higher rates means that you will have, once inflation is back to target and policy is normalized at a higher level than what we were before, means that there will be more room for conventional policy easing, which maybe will prevent central banks from having to use asset purchases again. So rebuilding this buffer of conventional policy space is actually something that doesn't sound so bad to central banks. But at the same time, note that this is putting a higher burden instead on the fiscal authorities. The reason is that first, rates permanently higher means higher financing costs for the government, and this is something that will have to be dealt with on a permanent basis and not by maybe exploiting the buffers built during the era of low interest rates. In turn, higher financing costs mean even less fiscal space for fiscal policy maneuver when the need will come. So this is, you see that the way I like to portray here the trade-off is that these two conditions, they imply a different burden sharing between the central bank and the fiscal authority. Again, there's no free lunch here. Either someone bears the burden, central bank, or the government will have to. So, of course, this is not black and white situations. There's plenty of scope for having for portraying the current situation as something in between these two stylized poles, if you want. So it's not either one or the other. The two explanations can coexist to a certain extent. And I just wanted to lay it out clearly because I think it's important to assess clearly what the implications and the trade-offs are. So let me conclude with something on how the global dimension, that's the main theme of this conference, enters the picture I just painted. So I'm no expert in global trade or value chains, so I don't have a particularly interesting view of how the future of value chains and international trade will look like. One thing I know, though, and one thing that we discussed quite extensively with my colleagues at the BIS, is the role that globalization paid in the inflation process in the years since the 2000s. And in many of our publications in the past, we argued that back then, globalization has been a favorable wind for central banks in their efforts to keep inflation in check. There's two reasons for that. One is very simply the downward trend in the relative price of imported goods that just put a lid on imported inflation from above. And the second, which is a bit more subtle, is through diminishing the sensitivity of inflation to domestic slack. This is basically a consequence of the fact that under a very integrated global system, if there's labor market tightness in one country, maybe firms can shift quite swiftly the production abroad, and therefore circumvent the price pressures that will come from this excessive domestic tightness. Now, a reversal of the globalization process, be it because we want to make our value chains more resilient, rather less risky, rather than more efficient, will lead to an unwinding of this favorable downward pressure on inflation that has been exerted by globalization in the past. Though let me stress that at the same time, making inflation more sensitive to domestic economic condition, domestic slack, will in principle also make it more sensitive to domestic monetary policy, and so in a sense increase the grip that central banks can have on inflation through aggregate demand by means of steering the policy rate in a very conventional and old-fashioned way of running monetary policy. So, thanks very much. I hope this was useful to set the stage, and I look forward to the rest of the discussion.
Thank you very much for setting it for us for the rest of our discussion. And I turn immediately to a dear friend and colleague, Nowotny, governor, for me, governor of the Austrian Central Bank, but some of them, he was is also the president of the Austrian Gesellschaft für Europolitik, was a very, very important figure in the European Central Bank, in the Governing Council of the European Central Bank until August 2019, and the rest is listed in his bio on the program. I can tell you that at least for me, having interacted with him very much, at least 2 of the 3 items of communications were covered. The transmitter was very, very much in place, was always speaking for the policymakers of the European Central Bank in a great authority, and the content of the message was always very, very clear, and he cannot control the receiver, so this is something that will need to be seen. So thank you so much, and you are more than welcome to take the floor.
Thank you very much, Jakob. And also first I want to thank the Reinventing Bretton Woods Committee for bringing this conference here to Vienna and also here to this institution of the Diplomatische Diplomatic Academy, which has a very important and prestigious place in the Austrian academic life. It is said that once a central banker, always a central banker, and at least the 3 of us sitting here proof of this. But being a retired central banker brings the privilege that you can deal more with the medium and long-term perspectives. And this is what I want to do in my short presentation here. And I'm very grateful that I can follow the introduction by Marco Lombardi on this. I will speak on 2 issues. One, rates of inflation in a medium-term perspective, and the second, the specific aspects of monetary policy in that field. Concerning the rates of inflation, I'm following what Marco Lombardi said. I think it will be difficult to get back to this, or at least costly, to get back to this goal of 2%. One has to be sure that there is a certain amount of flexibility, which, by the way, also is in the formulation of this 2%, because it's a medium-term goal. Of course, it's important not to de-anchor expectations, but I think the expectations are quite reasonable, anchored. And if you look at the forward rates on the capital markets, they are about this 2 to 3% range. And I think this is what we are really talking about. Concerning these future perspectives of inflation, the first element is, of course, globalization. We're all convinced globalization is not dead, it will go on, but it will be more costly. And I think it should be more costly out of environmental reasons, out of social reasons. And that will, of course, have an effect on the long-term inflation rate. And in fact, I think one has to be quite honest. This wonderful period of the great moderation that we enjoyed in the first decades of 2000, where we had low inflation and adequate growth, was not so much due to the wisdom of central banks. It was the effect of low price imports from China. That was the main point of it. And this will have still imports, but not at this low price. And so therefore, globalization will go on, but it will have at higher prices. A second aspect is demography. And this is a point that is especially relevant for Europe, and unfortunately also specifically for Eastern Europe, where we have a shrinking working population, which will translate into higher wages. And that is, it's okay as such, but of course, again, this will have an effect relatively on prices. We have, thirdly, what's called greenflation. We have to be quite honest. The aspects of climate policies to transform the economy are costly. and these costs will be reflected in higher prices. Not dramatically, but with a certain tendency. And last aspect in this point is that we will see for quite a longer period of time higher public deficits. There are huge demands on public expenditures, starting again from climate policy in most countries, especially again Europe. We will have an increase in military expenditure. We will have an increase in social expenditures again because of demographics. So that would mean again a demand surplus, and that of course is also an element of that could lead to a tendency of higher rates of inflation. So these are, let's say, the real economy effects. We have just now also some specifically monetary effects. And I think one element that is visible already now and that might be of quite substantial relevance is that we see longer, medium and long-term, higher medium and long-term rates. That means the bond market. That means this is the market where central banks do not have a direct influence, because central banks have a direct influence on the short-term rates. But what we see now is a very substantial increase in the long-term rates. Again, for a number of reasons. In some way, this has to be seen as a normalization, because we had a pretty long-term period of time when we had an inverse rate curve. That means, well, short-term rates were above the long-term rates, which clearly is something that cannot last for long. So in some way it's a normalization, but it is of course a normalization with many effects. Effects on industry, especially on industries where interest rate payments are very important. This is, for instance, construction industry, real estate. We just see this already now. It may have effects on bond markets for specific countries that have already now high ratios of debt to GDP. So one has to be very careful not to recreate a euro crisis. And we have, of course, as you all know, countries, or at least especially one country, that is always a bit in danger of being a victim of such a situation. So that means this is something that may have strong, long-lasting effects. And this is helped to a certain extent exactly because we have central banks have entered the period of quantitative tightening. That means central banks are reducing their balance sheets. And we have, since August of this year for the ECB, the first time since the start of the euro area, a reduction in the M3 volume of money, which is, my friends know, I'm by no means a monetarist, but still, of course, the dynamics of M3, of the volume of money, are an indicator. And this is an indicator that one, I think, has to be to take quite seriously. So to sum up, I think what should be our aim is, in this constellation that we have now, to achieve a soft landing. That means avoid shocks. There are some kind of groups that think shocks are healing. I think shocks are especially difficult and dangerous, because if it starts, you cannot control how it goes on. So therefore, I think central banks should very much be engaged in this approach of a soft landing. That will mean that in any case, we have a medium-term perspective of lower growth compared to the decades of, let's say, the Great Moderation period. We may have somewhat higher rates of inflation, again, compared to this Great Moderation period. But altogether, one could see this as a normalization. This is a situation where we have kind of adequate but not too high rates of growth, where we have inflation rates that are not too low but not too high, and where we therefore have interest rates that are where clearly the long-term interest rates is above the short-term interest rates, and we are in a constellation that we have known for many years in the industrialized world. That sounds a bit idyllic, but of course it means that for the specific countries, for the specific regions, and it was mentioned here that we also have to think about, not about only the northern world, but the southern world. Of course, for instance, for the southern world, this might have dramatic effects, because with the huge debt that they have accumulated in the last decades, of course, every situation of higher interest rates makes a problem, and even more so the aspect of liquidity. I think we have to see interest rates are not the main problem today, it's liquidity. Because if central banks are reducing liquidity, that means that everybody, every firm that has relied on short-term financing may get under quite difficult conditions. And again, we have seen already such constellations. So I think there are lots of reasons to move on cautiously, in a cautious way, to achieve a soft landing. I think it's possible, but it will not be achieved without some very good and strategic thinking. That's my part of it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Governor Nowotny. And this leads us naturally to our next speaker. As you can see, the panorama that we are having is we started from after getting the view from the BIS about where we are, we started from an advanced, traditional, leading European economy, how it figures, and now we will move to another governor from what used to be a transition economy that made it, so to speak, to the current team. Governor Miroslav Singer is Director of Institutional Affairs at Generali, but I believe it will be fair to say that your ticket to join us here is that you are part of the team of former central bank governors. And indeed, you have spent significant time of your adult career at the Czech National Bank, rising through from deputy governor to governor of the Czech National Bank, and being indeed very, very instrumental in leading the economy to very successful performance. And indeed, the Czech National Bank has received significant recognitions over the years from various bodies that look at these matters, but I will not elaborate. You can see it all in the resume, and I'll immediately pass the microphone to Governor Miroslav Singer, my friend. Good.
Well, thanks a lot, Jacob. Thanks for the invitation. It's a pleasure. I'm speaking this fall. This is the third time I'm speaking on different occasion in the place which in 19th century was considered the largest Czech city until all these Nowotnys and Duchaceks switched to Austrian nationality. And as always, happy to be here. I will talk about three things. I will talk about why it may not be so easy to control high inflation with interest rates, as was presumed by Marco Lombardi. And then I will talk about how globalization changed the world, because I really like to have a look on how the sizes of different parts of the world changed in the last 25 years, so not 30, but it really doesn't matter. And I will conclude that what does it mean for interest rates, in my opinion. So let me start with saying that in principle, as a central bankers, we always like to use the tool which has unlimited quantity. It's way a lot easier because it's more easy to use it, but it's also more easy to approach expectations with such tool because the markets, the players know we have no limits. So in terms of deflation, it's much more advisable to use any quantitative easing than interest rates, because interest rates have clear limit, somewhere below zero, perhaps, but at some point the economy players simply start hoarding cash, which can be held at no cost as opposed to negative costs of interest due to interest rates. So I mean, quantitative easing is a tool for deflation, and interest rate with its unlimited scope of going up is the tool for inflation. So in principle, inflation should be easier because we all like interest rates. That's in a nutshell. And there are limits. And I believe the two limits for this approach are first the limit of fiscal stability concerns. Central banks, if not solely, but typically they are part of the groups that are responsible for fiscal stability, and they are viewed by our citizens as being responsible for that, which, don't forget, central banks are independent, but they are part of a political system. Yeah, that's it. It's in a general sense. So, okay, and we see examples of that now. I mean, like we saw examples of that in Hungary. Hungary obviously had to put a stop of using the major interest rates in a way up, because it started risking the balance sheets of parts of its financial system. So they had to resort to extraordinary daily rates increases and so on. And it seemed it worked so far, but we see there are limits for that approach. Yeah? So interest rates cannot go up in an unlimited way. And second, those are political and sovereignty concerns of central banks. And we tend to forget them, but I believe in 70s, returning back to 70s, Barnes, Fed chairman of that time, once famously observed that he can control the inflation with interest rate, but he doesn't feel to be entitled to decide the destiny of US-Vietnamese war by ruining the economy. And now we see it as well. I mean, like, green concern is an obvious elephant in a room. I mean, like, the central banks are taking green concerns. Most of the central banks are taking green concerns as something granted, despite whatever is said in law on price stability and other issues. Yeah? ECB is a major example of that. So, okay, so there are concerns. And question is whether those concerns can make the central banks, which are effectively sovereignty concerns, yeah? They are existential concerns. Concerns going above inflation or above economic motives of governing. We see some issues being more important. And is the world growing in a way that those issues are getting less or more important? Well, let me summarize what happened in a word in a nutshell in the last 25 years. In Asia, despite all talk about Eastern Asia growing fast, if you plot the average growth rate in last 25 years, last quarter of century, and the starting point in GDP per capita terms, of course you get expected regression line, which is downward sloping because convergence, poorer grow faster, and the richer grow less fast in the last 25 years. Not that certain. But if you have a look on the position of countries around this line, you realize that China is the only big successful case in Eastern Asia. I mean, small cases exist, like Vietnam, perhaps Hong Kong above the line, but those really do not matter in terms of having a million or 200 million populations. Malaysia's, Indonesia's, Thailand's, India's, they are below or at the regression line, which, by the way, is quite robust on whether you include countries or not. So here we have a super successful case in Asia, and the rest of Asia, much less cases to be happy. And of course, one completely unsuccessful failure of Asia, which tends to be forgotten, which is Japan. Japan is one of the very few countries which degrows in terms of size of US dollars or in terms of US dollars per GDP capita. Like it's really amazing. Actually, I've been looking on usual suspects like Zimbabwe or Venezuela. No, even those countries grew in last 25 years. The only second country I saw mimicking the failure of Japan is Syria, but Syria needed a civil war for that. Japan managed peacefully. So this is Asia, and you see that Asia, with this sort of development, you have a power, I would say, change. I mean, Japan out, a lot of countries less happy, and successful China. Then moving to Europe. First, Europe, of course, as an entity, grew very lot slower than US. So Europe is really losing the power. And the only part of Europe that grew fast, actually very successfully fast, is the new Europe. It's not only Baltics, it's also Central Europe, but also and chiefly it's Balkans. Bulgaria and Romania grew very fast. Romania, actually, the size of Romanian economy is now bigger than the size of Czech economy. GDP per capita in Romania, it's at 4/5 of GDP in Hungary in pure US dollar terms. It's not. And talking about that, the second big entity here is Poland, of course. By the way, size of Polish economy is 1/4 of size of China. Good to know. And Romania and Poland are countries that are very well aware and very historically sensitive about the country that didn't grow that successfully, but reasonably successfully until 2014. And then it started building to its own the army that is in many measures more sizable than Chinese one, with 1/6 to 1/10, depends how you measure it, of Chinese economy, which I didn't find a sustainable path, which is Russia, of course. So here we have in Europe, the only country which importance is growing are those who are afraid of Russia, or in historical tension with Russia. And Russia is growing completely in unsustainable paths, building its extra heavy army comparing with its size. And then we have US, which effectively keeps its own weight in the world economy, thanks to population growth partially, but keeps. And then we have Latin America, which is completely unsuccessful story. I mean, like, even the premiant, which is considered here to be a Chile, is way below the regression convergence, average convergence path line. So can we derive from that we will have less sovereignty issues concerning the central bank, or if you want, existential issues for countries that will force central banks to not to be only focused on inflation and being more supportive and accommodative? I believe no. I believe it's the answer is clearly that the globalization is not working in a way that has not been working in a way that's de-risking the world. And quite contrary. Which leads me back to Jacob's introduction on rates and inflation and higher for longer. And I must say, I've been driving yesterday on one snowy hill of Prague, seeing the kids with slides, enjoying the weather, as opposed to probably some of us. And I realized, yes, this is how I remember my childhood, in the same hill. Is it normal? So returning back, is it normal to have a snow in winter here? Of course it is normal. Is it normal to want more than can be produced in times of stress, in times of tensions? Yes, it is normal. So is it normal to have higher interest rates and inflation in such times? Yes, of course it is normal. And if you have a look on last 100 years of US inflation, you realize the current inflation is far from exceptional. The only thing that's historically exceptional in the long run is the pace of change from low inflation to higher inflation, meaning the acceleration. But otherwise, we are now in pretty normal times, and I believe we are, in this respect, we are in tension times, and tension times wants more to be produced, and more to be produced simply keeps inflation higher. That's my take on it.
Thank you very much, Miroslav. And indeed, as we are moving on that hill that you described, we arrive to a dear friend, Kairat Kelimbetov, I should say from Kazakhstan. Kairat needs no introduction to this forum, and indeed his resume is in the program and very, very long. I can only say that for me, he represents the essence of Kazakhstan economic financial structure. He has been the governor of the AIFC, Astana International Financial Center, which is the financial services hub that operates in Kazakhstan and has modernized through it the governance of the system and all the rest. And it's not an accident that he arrived to this position following a very broad portfolio of almost everything that one needs to have in the Kazakhstan's political structure, a governor of the central bank, deputy prime minister, minister of economic development, CEO of various agencies. So this is a good time to ask you, and let me just remind, he is now senior advisor of Freedom Horizons, which means he's looking into the horizon. So share with us a little bit your experience and the horizon. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So first of all, I also would like to thank the organizer of this event, and first of all, Mark Uzan with his idea to reinvent Bretton Woods. I think it's after so many years, 80 years actually this year, we will celebrate it when we just have to figure out how the new global financial system should look like. And I think it's a different aspects of this we will discuss today, and really also appreciate for the presentation been done previously. I will come back later on to some particular issues, but also it's an honor to be in Vienna, and especially in Diplomatic Academy. Thank you very much, Ambassador, for your hospitality. So it seems like it's educated the global leaders 1794. It means like probably 54. So the members of the Vienna Congress in 1815 been all over there, starting from the legendary Chancellor von Metternich, probably been here also. So it's a quite it's a big responsibility to be in this room, and I think we will also start to compare the different regions. And been mentioned this morning that so probably the more people from the Western community here, less people from the Global South. So I assume like I'm the only representative for the Global South. Even I'm from the country in the South, which much colder than in the Central Europe today. I also would like to applaud Jacob Frenkel, who is a person who really contributed to the development of the global financial system, especially the development of International Monetary Fund. So I think that he contributed a lot to this. And I remember his famous joke like a few years ago about the conventional monetary policy, just to remind you that he said that the unconventional monetary policy is coming as a mother-in-law, coming unexpectedly and never leaving, let's say. So these are kind of cultural aspects of the different perception of the conventional and unconventional policy. And so let me back to the what is the influence, because I'm kind of representing emerging markets today. So we're talking about more influence to the big economies like US economy and EU economy, but the changes in US and EU economy are very much affected to the emerging markets. And I think that it's good that the Marco this morning brought us back to the 1970s, where it was like probably the more or less similar situation was like after the oil supply shock in 1973, or even starting of stagflation in the late 60s in Europe. So it's kind of the same intellectual problem what to do and how to, let's say, to have a low inflation from one side and at the same time high rate of the growth. And so here is always the dilemma, especially in big economies like US economy and EU economy, is a kind of what is the nature of the let's say of inflation. Is it just monetary because of the money supply, or is it also the supply and demand issues like in Europe, probably linked to the energy price has been mentioned by the Governor Singer, that the elephant in the room is energy transition in Europe. And we've seen in 2021, it was like huge influence already, started before even what happened afterwards in 2022. And so I believe that these are kind of the big, both like a structural and cyclical issues, and especially for emerging markets. So emerging markets are definitely very much affected by the recent, let's say, changes from quantitative easing to quantitative tightening, when we have a capital flow volatility. So mostly in emerging markets, so we've seen outflows from those markets. It's slightly different for commodities exporting countries like Kazakhstan or Russia or Azerbaijan, because it's more was inflows in trade. But at the same time, so it's a huge inflationary pressure, it's a currency pressures. So we've seen it's like increasing our debt servicing costs. So it's a huge influence, and I think is always very much important to focus on right policy. And as usually, so probably is a cliche, but it's good when during the crisis you use this time in order to really to make good reform to the modern monetary policy. And as a person who's been governor of central bank for a couple of years, we've been focused on the significant changes in monetary policy. So we move from the fixed exchange rate to the inflation targeting policy, which been, let's say, invented in the mid of 70s by New Zealand. But I think that these is maybe not panacea, has been mentioned, but is also very important, necessary part of the arms of the central bank and, let's say, of the authorities. And I think in these terms, very much important to create a system which can absorb all the shocks and can make your economy more resilient. So in these terms, this let's say inflation targets, free float of the exchange rates is a much more flexible monetary policy rather than fixed exchange rate. And we, by the way, the Czech central bank helped us to develop the capacity in building the economic models. Thank you very much, and we absolutely appreciate that we are on the way to really be part of this club with who already step in inflation targeting regime. In terms of the inflation dynamics, here is a little bit different discussion probably with the developed markets, because we in emerging markets we used to have this let's say structural high rate of inflation. So you remember that. So probably, and been mentioned by Mr. Singer, that it was recently really high economic growth rates in our countries, but it's due to the low base, let's say. I can add that Kazakhstan is, I'm proud that Kazakhstan is been in a good shape, so that our economy is 60% GDP of Central Asia in comparison with the other countries, and we achieved kind of more than 10K dollars per capita in recent reforms, and we are kind of in line with the countries who are successful in transition from the previous system to the let's say to the new one. But at the same time, we've seen like how many emerging markets been unsuccessful on this. I agree that there was a lot of problems in Latin America, and at the same time, like is a famous anecdote about Argentinian economists not scared about high inflation, let's say, and the same we now see that difficult situation in Turkey. So I believe that the new government is doing a great job in terms of really to respond to the high inflation rate. Also, I think very much important issue is the coordination of the monetary policy with fiscal policy, which been mentioned as well. And I think Marco mentioned about this, let's say, here's like a dilemma, it should be harmony, who is taking the burden? Is it like a fiscal policy? And so this is also costly because you are increasing, you are affecting your debt sustainability, you are affecting to your, let's say, fiscal reserves position, or it should be more kind of on the shoulders of the monetary policy for emerging markets. So mostly I think is a more case of the taking the fiscal stimulus response, and not many countries are really quite responsible on this, because in Kazakhstan we have a low rate of the public debt, we have a significant buffer, so we have a special sovereign wealth fund where we put all this money from the oil revenues, but not many countries can, let's say, allow them to have this. And in these terms, very important the coordination of the monetary policy and a fiscal policy. And coordination, I think that the most important issues are like independence of the central bank from one side, but independence doesn't mean isolation. And I think that central bank should be part of the broader term discussion about the fiscal stimulus responses, because he's finally, first of all, responsible for the price stability, and he should be part of this discussion where can really seriously affect it to the money supply issues in any countries. So as a central bank, we're also responsible for the, not only for the price stability, but also for the financial stability. As usually there is a prejudice that there is no kind of a good capacity of the financial stability for emerging markets. I think that due to the recent development and due to the how many crises we went through, we have very good standards now for financial stability. And even we have still from the global rating agencies like lower ratings than the developed countries, which is affected to the, again, to the access to the capital, global capital. So anyway, I think that so we are doing great job on this, and not always like developed countries are not good on financial stability, but we've recently seen like financial stability issues with the banking system in the United States or some European countries' banks. So that means that we have really kind of revisit the standards of financial stability, maybe using also the new tools, which probably later on we will discuss as like a new technologies, some like related to the big data analysis, predictive analysis, but also maybe using the AI development. So probably we can summarize a lot of data, we'll enrich this data, and we can use this data lake in order to, let's say, equip the central bank governors teams with better ideas how to proceed further. So I didn't mention the second elephant in the room yet, which is fragmentation of the global economy and geopolitical turmoil, which we do have, and especially European economy probably very much affected from the recent conflict in our part of the world. And I think that this is something which is the macroeconomic policies should be responded and should be somehow adapted because it's like also part of the new normal, and we should know how to manage it. And especially for Kazakhstan, for example, we have these issues as a country with a low complexity of the structure of our economy. So we are always imported a lot of the consumer goods, and we imported inflation from Russia, for example. And these are some issues which we also would like to learn from the other countries how to manage these issues. And finally, I would like to say that so many opinions around what would be the next stage of the globalization. Would be it's more deglobalization in terms of the, like a more development of the different regional clubs, but at the same time I think that everyone benefits from the certain types of the globalization, payment system, traveling, let's say common, creating common public goods in terms of the climate change. So I think in these terms would be great if you always have a dialogue. It's not like a dialogue only within the structures of the global financial institutions. I remember like in the World Bank, for example, you have a Department of Europe and Central Asia, or in IMF you have a Central Asia and GCC, but the attempts of Mark Uzan to build dialogue of continent is much richer to my mind, and so we can really bring Latin America successful or non-successful experience and to share it with Central Asia and Eastern European countries and the other way around. So let me stop here. Would be happy to join later on to the questions.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Our next speaker in this order is Atanas Pekanov, who is an economist at WIFO and participates in the research group on macroeconomic and public finance. From the policy perspective, I would note that he is a member of the Council of Social, Economic and Development to the President of the Republic of Bulgaria, focusing on macroeconomics. Why don't you take the floor now? Thank you.
Hello from me. Let me start by thanking the organizers and Mark for organizing this great event. It's always a big pleasure for me to talk in Vienna. It's been my second home or my main home for the past decade. And as was said, I'm an economist at WIFO, mainly doing analysis on monetary policy, but I had the great honor until this summer to serve in numerous Bulgarian technical governments as Deputy Prime Minister for European funding and in charge of the Bulgarian Recovery and Resilience Plan. So in this discussion, I will try to connect the two topics, especially because I believe that in the last 2 years, we saw the importance of the monetary fiscal interactions in Europe and how different interventions are crucial, especially in times of crisis, and how actually the different interventions that we have done in the last years have brought us to this situation today. They have actually enabled the higher, I'm not so sure if it's going to be for longer, but for sure higher environment that we see today. And I don't say that in a bad way. I actually think I say it in a good way because different interventions that were done, especially at the height of the pandemic, but also after that, contributed to, I would say, a rather successful recovery, economic recovery. And maybe we don't talk enough about this, the recovery of the large shock that, if you think about it, when I talk to students, for example, if you think about it, the shock that we observed in 2020 was something that we would never conceive before that. Closing all economic activity for a number of weeks or months, and then coming back, closing the output gap in only a year or a year and a half, I think was a very big policy success. So as I said, until recently, back home in Bulgaria, I was part of the government and serving as Deputy Prime Minister for European funding, and Bulgaria receives a lot of European funding, and especially now with the new framework under Next Generation EU and under the Recovery and Resilience Plan mechanism. So let me talk quite briefly on that, and then I'll try to relate it to the current environment. Going back, let's say at the beginning of the pandemic or even pre-pandemic, and I will always talk from my two hats. One is an economist, which sees this new tool, which we now have developed at the European level, the Next Generation EU. From a macroeconomist point of view, it's always like from a plane, like seeing a very nice field or a farm and everything looks great. This fund, Next Generation EU, from a macroeconomic point of view, I would argue serves its function and has actually delivered on what it was supposed to deliver. But then also talk from the other view, which is the practitioner, the implementation, governance point of view, which is, in a sense, the road not taken. This is the first time that we have such a tool, such as the Recovery and Resilience Mechanism and Next Generation EU in Europe. It's a fiscal risk-sharing tool partly, but it's also a large public investment program. And going through this mechanism, implementing it, indeed, is not as beautiful as it seems from the plane. It's not always that easy. But it is very important in the EMU framework, so this is why we have to address any outstanding challenges. So let me start first by saying, why do I say it's a success? I think from a macro point of view, Next Generation EU was exactly what it was supposed to do. So first of all, it is a fiscal risk-share instrument that its first goal was to decrease or calm down market stress, especially at the height of the crisis. And we could see that it did exactly that. With its announcement in May, so if you remember, at the 18th of May was the first announcement that Germany and France have finally crossed this Rhine-Main divide that we know from Professor James, that they have finally made the conclusion that we need such a common instrument. And you could see in the data that this announcement had almost the same effect on government bond spreads of many countries and most countries, this is May 2020, almost the same effect as the PEP announcement of the ECB. So you could see that that's a very good example, I think, of the monetary fiscal interactions, which especially during crisis are so important. So it kind of pushed down risk premia and helped us get through the most difficult phase. This is, I think, the first and foremost contribution, a macroeconomic fiscal stabilization tool, which in a sense has a redistribution element, and this is rightly so. It has a bigger share of funding for member states which were more affected by the pandemic, like Italy or Spain, or for member states which start from a lower level, like Bulgaria, Croatia, Greece. Second of all, it also changed how the EU is presented in international capital markets. It expanded vastly the issuance of EU bonds, something that I think many economists, macroeconomists have for a long time put as a problem for Europe, the lack of safe assets which are denominated in euro. If you think about it, in 2019, the EU issued bonds, EU bonds in the amount of 5 billion. In 2020, it issued bonds in the amount of 100 billion. So a complete change in magnitude in the presence of EU-denominated assets, which makes the EU stronger. This also affects the international role of the euro and also had a normative effect because some of these bonds were green bonds, the biggest issuances of green bonds there were, and they were actually taken with huge interest, it seems, from financial markets. So I would argue that on its first role, being a macroeconomic stabilization tool, it delivered. Its second role I see as protecting public investment. Protecting public investment because we don't want to repeat some of the, I would say, mistakes of past crises, which meant that at some point you start fiscal consolidation, which is good. Most probably we should start it now in Europe as well. But the bad side of fiscal consolidation is that very often it mainly affects public investment. So I saw it also from the practice as a politician. Cutting social expenditure, cutting other types of social programs is almost impossible. So what you cut when you have to do fiscal consolidation is public investment. Public investment that actually in the long term makes our economy stronger. It enhances the potential of the economy and makes it most probably more productive. This is what happened after 2009, 2010, and you can still see in the data the share of public investment as part of government expenditure or take any other measure has not really recovered in Europe until 2020. So the second function of Next Generation EU is not only to stabilize market stress, to reduce risk premium in the crisis, but also ensure, guarantee public investment for the long run. It seems to be doing so. Now the third goal is normative, to ensure some common goals, and in 2020, the member states agreed that this will be the green and digital transition. So public investment, but public investment is something that we all share. This is important because in the end, the joint borrowing has to be backed up by some joint goals. If we finance something together at the EU level, it has to be something that there is acceptance to. And I think on the green and digital transition, on the digital for sure there is. On the green, I see some skepticism now crawling. So this is an issue that I have also seen in Bulgaria, and it is rightly so, because people are partly scared of the green transition. I'll come back to this. But it will ensure these investments. Actually, member states have committed a larger share to green and digital investments from their national recovery and resilience plans, from the funding that they get from the EU through Next Generation EU, than actually was necessary. So they have overcommitted, and that's good. Finally, the fourth function of Next Generation EU is structural reforms. Now, there was a very long discussion already before the pandemic on this. Do we want to make any EU funding performance-based? Do we want to bind it, so to say, to structural reforms? I think this is good. In the case of Bulgaria, it has helped us, especially, for example, to push some extremely necessary reforms in the area of the rule of law, which I was a big proponent of, and it took a long time, but finally Parliament, during the time of the Technic government, agreed and adopted especially those rule of law with anti-corruption measures that for a long time were recommended by the European Commission, and we know that the country-specific recommendations for a long time, I would say member states under-delivered on what was expected from them. The RRPs, the Recovery and Resilience Plans, are a tool to push member states in the direction of doing those structural reforms. Now here I would say that the performance is not yet there where it should be, and here I will come to the second point, which is challenges. So this common fund that we have, it delivered on the macro functions that it had. However, I see this in, I would say, all member states. I saw it in Bulgaria because this was my job, but I saw it also in all member states. These recovery and resilience plans, they are a full government program of investments and reforms. And reforms, they are painful. So at some point in each member state, we reach the point where governments don't want to push anymore for further reforms. And they are even willing to somehow say, well, we actually don't need this money. This is a problem. This is a challenge that I see in all member states. In Bulgaria, it is particularly the case in the area of the green transition, of decarbonization. People see the steps taken as, I would say, too ambitious, too fast, risking the jobs in specific regions. These are the core regions in Bulgaria, which have difficulties in the transition, especially in a fast transition to carbon neutrality, which is a must, which is a goal, which I share. But I also understand the people in different regions in Bulgaria, still the lowest GDP per capita country, not to be so willing to change, to, I would say, let go of some sectors which are still profitable and are still making relatively large income. Wages in the coal sector in Bulgaria, for example, are much higher than the median wage in the country. So I see the challenges, and I see the challenges in all other member states, because in each member state there are some reforms which are, well, not so popular. Well, people don't like them. So this is leading now to the delays of these recovery and resilience plans. This means that many member states are, I would say, much slower in obtaining these funds and making these public investments. Actually, quite ironically, this means that on the fiscal side, we did the real aggregate demand push in the years of the pandemic, so public investment started, and this also pushed economic activity. And now, when we also want to do a bit of dampening of aggregate demand, this absorption of these funds is slower, but for the overall mechanism, this is a problem. This is a challenge, and I think and I hope that there will be more flexibility on this, because this is a powerful tool. This is a powerful tool that helped us with the recovery and brought us to this situation right now, to the situation where the recovery was done quite quickly, and people say, and I see the point of saying, well, we even exaggerated. We exaggerated with all of these tools. Maybe that is true, maybe not. But it is important to point that through this common mechanism, through Next Generation EU, we have locked in low interest rates for public investment, and basically, so to say, it doesn't matter whether we come back to the R-star of Lubick Matthijs or of Holston Laubach Williams, for some public investment in Europe, they will be protected and they will be funded through very good conditions in the coming years, which actually paves the way and enables central banks to do their job. It takes away some of the burden of being over-simulative or too long to stay in a low interest rate environment, because the fiscal policy at the EU level has taken part of this burden, and it took it when it actually mattered, when it was necessary. So I think this is a development that we are sometimes overseeing, but which is crucial for the current environment. Now, coming to where we are right now, it is interesting that we use this, now everybody uses this metaphor of the last mile. But when I see the latest data, I'm not so sure if it's still a mile or maybe a couple of meters, because inflation is coming down. Of course, we have to stay credible. That means that it's too early to discuss changes, that is true. But given this environment, we have to take the right lessons. And the right lessons are that fiscal policy intervened when it was necessary. This, I think, made the job of the central bank easier and of monetary policy easier. And now, in time when we see that aggregate demand, or at least inflation, if not aggregate demand, is still strong, this is exactly the time to dampen the stimulus. And the one that actually matters for the long term, public investments, which are enhancing the potential of the economy, they will be protected because we revised the tools to do so. By understanding this, by explaining this, I think Europe is moving forward, and by doing so, also helping de-risk the overall very, very tense geopolitical environment in the world. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And as we are completing this side of the panorama, we go to Isabelle, Mateos, Lago. The important element that Isabelle is bringing to our proceedings is the private sector perspective of all of these kind of things that are happening. And there is nobody better to do it for us than Isabelle, being the global head of BlackRock Official Institutions Group, having been for years shaping the geopolitical risk analysis through the BlackRock Investment Institute, spending previously years at the IMF in variety of senior roles, and of course starting her career at the French Ministry of Finance. So with this background, please educate us about what all of you heard here is doing to the private sector perspective as you are positioned. Thank you very much, Isabelle.
Thank you very much, Chair. Good morning to all of you. It's a pleasure to be here, and very humbling to be hosted by an institution founded in 1754. Maybe it's because I'm French, but I can't think of any other institution that goes far that long ago. Anyway, so higher for longer. Let me start by saying I was, tempted to think, what was Mark going on about? You look at the most recent inflation data, it's coming down. You look at what central banks are doing around the world. Last month, we had more central banks cutting rates than hiking rates for the first time in 2 years. And if you look at recent market developments, well, markets are pricing over 100 basis points of rate cuts by both the Fed and the ECB next year. Starting potentially as early as March. So it would be tempting to say, well, let's move on to something else. This slogan that central bankers are still using, they're saying it, but they don't really believe it. They're just trying to convey that it's too soon that they're not there yet. But actually, what's perhaps more interesting is when you look at market pricing for central bank policy rates further out, several years out, they're very high. And this, to me, suggests that actually even the very short-sighted market participants, as we know, this is what market participants are, think there is something else going on here. And this is certainly how we at BlackRock think about this story, which is very much a structural one. This isn't about, are we heading for a soft landing? Are we going to have a mild recession or a no recession? We're structurally in a new regime compared to the pre-pandemic period. And this new regime is characterized by, I would say, 5 things that are going to be higher for longer. It's not going to be forever, but it's going to be for a good 5 to 10 years, I would think. And here I'm going to repeat some things that have been said before. Obviously, we're looking at the same reality, but I'm going to try maybe a slightly different framing. So the first thing that is going to be higher for longer is supply constraints. Supply constraints coming from either slower growing working age populations, in some cases outright shrinking working age populations. It's true in Europe, it's true in the US, it's true in China. Obviously the world as a whole doesn't have a population shortage, but attitudes towards immigrations are such that there is going to be tight labor supply going forward. Second source of supply constraints, you've all talked about it, the rejigging of globalization, fragmentation. Again, that's putting primacy over national sovereignty, other considerations beyond economic efficiency. And again, that creates supply constraints. Third driver is the energy transition. I think it was Governor Nowotny who referred to greenflation. But I would note that over the past couple of years, the main source of inflation hasn't been the green stuff. It's been the brown stuff. It's been oil and gas whose prices went up. And the point I'm trying to make here is that in the transition to the new steady state where all energy will be green, we will face bumps on the road because, investment in fossil fuel energies, to put it simply, is coming down, and demand is not coming down as fast as supply. So for these 3 reasons, supply constraints as far as the eye can see, there is some hope of this being alleviated, maybe in part by developments in artificial intelligence, and I was very pleased to see that Mark put this on the menu of this session. But in our view, this is something that will happen over time and perhaps will lessen the extent of the supply constraints, but not eliminate them. And so, second thing that will be higher because of this is inflation. Now, you could say it doesn't have to be inflation. It could be that you just decide to live with lower growth. But again, as Governor Nowotny said, this is probably not where we're going to land because it's, nobody quite liked the idea of just living with lower growth. And so there's going to be this constant trade-off between growth and inflation that central banks are going to face every time they're hit by a shock from anywhere. They're going to have to consider, okay, is that enough growth? Can we live with this? The politics around central banks and what they do already, people are quite angry at central banks for having let inflation get out of the bag, cost of living crisis, etc. And so our strong conviction, and I think when you look at inflation expectations, at least market pricing, they're pretty well anchored, but our view at BlackRock is actually this is probably too optimistic, and because of this new environment we're in and the politics of it, despite being independent, central banks on balance are going to err on the side of having inflation somewhat above target, not at 5%, but let's say they're going to say, well, it's a medium-term concept, and somewhere between 2 and 3 is just good enough, which is very different to the pre-COVID environment. Third thing that is going to be higher because of this is just macro volatility. And potentially, there's going to be bouts of financial instability as the system struggles to cope with this persistently tighter monetary policy. And so we're going to be in a world with just shocks happening much more often, endogenously, exogenously, and central banks not being able to come in and rescue rescue markets, rescue the economy the way they did in the run-up to the crisis. Now, fiscal policy also is going to face severe constraints in doing that because, as has been said by pretty much all the previous speakers, debt levels are very high, and pressures on government finances are going to remain high, not forever after, but persistently because of need to spend more on health and aging, because of the need to spend more on defense. You know, and again, this is not for central banks to take a view on the need to spend a lot more on defense, but this is just a reality that we're going to face. And it's a very different thing to finance public debt at negative rates than it is to finance it at, you know, 3, 4, 5%. You know, if you just look at the US, which has a, you know, very unsustainable fiscal policy right now, hopefully it's not going to be like that forever, and the overall debt level is lower than a number of countries in the euro area. But if you assume an average cost of debt of 5% through the end of the decade, which is not that far, by 2030, the US will be spending more in interest payments than on Medicare. That's a problem. And so again, the ability of fiscal policy to cushion shocks, as it did so well during the COVID crisis, I think realistically has to be called into question going forward. And then last thing, well, maybe not the last, but fifth main thing, which is an important factor in this new regime that will be higher for longer, is geopolitical instability. Now, maybe the previous order wasn't that great, as I think Jacob said, or at least it wasn't perfect, but certainly we're now in a transition where, you know, people talk of lack of global leadership, lack of rules of the game, or at least the rules of the game are being seriously challenged by a number of actors, and that is a fundamentally more unstable world. We had the Russian invasion of Ukraine. We had a series of coups in Africa. You can now, I think it was The Economist who, magazine, who wrote, you can now walk from you know, the Atlantic Ocean to the Red Sea, walking through countries that had coups in the last 12 to 18 months. This is not good. Now the conflict in the Middle East, and these are obviously completely unrelated, but it's just a sign of a world that is more unstable. We can't predict where the next one is going to be, but chances are there are just going to be these bouts of instability popping up, putting pressure on commodity supply chains, potentially other supply chains, and again, this cycle of a more shock-prone world with macro policies that can't really respond to it. So what does this all mean? Well, first of all, it means higher risk premia, in our view, which, if you look at the markets right now, they're not there. Equity risk premium is at an all-time low. The spreads on emerging market debt are very low. Spreads on corporate debt are, again, at historic lows. That doesn't make sense in our view. So if you're like trying to think, you know, where is there a disconnect, that may be one area. Second point, and I think some of you touched on this, term premium, you know, being just barely positive doesn't make a ton of sense for us, and given the pressures on, you know, this, well, the risk of high inflation, the pressures on public finances, we think term premium has to go up, and again, that could be destabilizing in parts of the markets when that happens. And the third thing I would say is much more dispersions in outcomes. Some, and this is true at company and at country level, but this lower for longer interest rate environment, and I'm not talking now policy rates, I'm talking across the whole rate curve, is a much less forgiving environment. And so those companies and countries that will spend the money wisely, that will invest in things that raise productivity, that raise productive capacity, they will do okay, and the others will go bust. And again, that's something we haven't seen in a long time, and so a much more contrasted environment. And then we'll realize that deglobalization maybe wasn't such a good idea, and it will hopefully go back in the other direction, and then at some point we'll have completed the energy transition and we'll realize energy is almost free, so everything will be good. But between now and then we may be in for a tough period. Thank you.
Mark suggests to skip the questions. Thank you very much for bringing us to this point. And as you were talking, I received some electronic messages from management, reminding us that there is a coffee break. And I can see all of you, you do not see all of you, so I could tell you only that many people did like this when I said coffee break. So that's what we will do. But let me just one word of transition to where we are going. I think that the diversity of the presentations may have covered some unity of message. And the unity of the message is, yes, we have a changing environment, we have a changing world, and the test will be how can we operate within a changing environment while maintaining the principles that are guiding us. There are crises and stresses that come from variety of directions, geographically, politically, reals, nominal. It's not just central banks. But if it's not just central banks, let's make sure that central banks do not remain the only game in town. Because in order to be able to deliver on the mission, the main mission of central banking, you must have political independence, and in order to be able to maintain it, you must stick to your main charge. Otherwise, you create a lack of clarity and also maybe give incentives to interfere with your basic messages. But having said this, and the second message is seen by the composition of people on this stage. You can discuss the macroeconomy of the world and the monetary policy of the world, but you cannot do it only by referring to central bankers alone. You need to have the perspective of the broad geographies as well as the broad range of issues, including geopolitical. And with this in mind, this brings us to the main raison d'etre of this particular conference and the venue itself. And I think that the co-sponsorship and the presence of Ambassador Dr. Emil Brix is only a testimony to it. All of you know, of course, the extraordinary breadth of his own background, whether it is in the diplomatic field, in Poland, in Russia, in the UK. Again, great diversity, all of which brings the Vienna School of International Studies to the center where such discussions can take place. So I'll just say that this marriage between the Reinventing Bretton Woods Committee and the Vienna School of International Studies has already started, and will be hopefully moving on into the future. So let me now tell you, you have all earned a very good excuse for a coffee break, and by spending more time with us, you have all earned also the message that we are going to shorten the coffee break so that you will be able to join a little later. It is now 11:30 local time, and let's try to be back in 15 minutes. Thank you very much.